I'm Mike Kohler. I am the Elevate Training Coordinator. Elevate Training is a program of the Larimer County Economic and Workforce Development Department. This activity today is clearly on the economic development side. That is, information that is being shared today is intended to strengthen all the businesses regionally and have us prepared for the changes that are coming about effective January 1st. So we thank you all for registering and showing up and participating. In December, as a follow-up from this overview of the big picture, if you will, of legal and regulatory issues that are forthcoming, Amanda Erickson and Jeannie Valliere of HRX Services will be doing two-part mini-series in December, workshops that take a deeper dive into some of the topics that will be covered today. So it's my pleasure to introduce Amanda Erickson, who, well, I could go on with biographical stuff about her, but I will just tell you that as a friend and colleague, I am just so delighted that she'll be sharing this overview today, because I can think of very few that are more qualified than Amanda to dispense this knowledge to you. So Amanda, on that note, I will let you take over, and thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That is a lovely introduction. The feeling is mutual for sure. And so I want to say thank you to everyone coming in today. We do appreciate your time. I will value and make sure that I respect your time. And so we will have you out here at 3 o'clock. There's a lot to unpack with this, but before we get started, a couple of quick housekeeping things. First, we are recording this session. So just know that if you don't catch everything, we will be providing that recording afterward, as well as if you do not want to participate in a recorded session, then we would ask that you exit now. But for the most part, it really should just be me probably on camera. That's it. We are using the meeting tool for Zoom for this meeting, so you are welcome to unmute yourself or use the camera. However, we do a lot of people in the session. So I would also say that it is 100% okay if you also want to chat in any questions. I will try to manage those as we work through this. So as long as the question is pertinent to what we're talking about right then, I will introduce it. At the end, I will try to make sure that I can answer any questions that we had at that time. So I know we do have somebody saying, oh, Mike, that's you. Okay, I'm gonna see if I can make you the co-host, and then we'll go from there. All right, you should be good. Okay, so that being said, it looks like I've got everybody in. We'll go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Amanda Erickson, and I am one of the owners, along with Jeannie Valliere, my business partner for HRX Services. We really focus on helping companies support their HR efforts. We're not an outsourcing company. We're really just an additional partner to the organization to help them get HR tasks and techniques and things they need done. That being said, let's talk about what I am not. I am not an attorney. So please keep in mind that anything that I'm sharing with you is all best practice, things that we've learned. We participate very heavily in a lot of things down at the legislature, as well as some of the sessions that are happening. We've testified on this particular piece of legislation. So we're certainly involved and engaged, but we are not attorneys. So keep that in mind. As far as the information I'm sharing, it should not be considered legal advice. And we always recommend that you turn to your partners in those areas for anything that is specific and legal with regards to your own organization. That being said, let's dive in. So Equal Pay for Equal Work Act, what is it, right? So the act starts on January 1st, 2021, so a little about 6 weeks from now. The goal of the legislation was to avoid pay discrimination based on sex or sex in another protected class for substantially similar work, meaning you have people who are doing substantially similar positions, but are getting paid differently. The goal of this act is to avoid that and instead make sure that positions are measured by skill, effort, and responsibility. So it would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about how we got here. If this is your first session, welcome. I'm going to give you a little timeline. If this is not your first rodeo, then hopefully I'm providing some good context for you as well, as you've been on a lot of webinars around this. So first and foremost, I always like to share that, in the state of Colorado, our legislators term out. So there are term limits required for our state government, a little different than the federal side. And so even though the terms can have a long time, meaning that they can do a several term back-to-back kind of situation, then move from a representative to a senator. So you do have some legislators in the state of Colorado who are there for a while, but oftentimes our legislators are just normal folks like you and me, people who were business owners or bankers, realtors, and our legislative session in the state of Colorado only goes from about January until I think the end of April. This last session was a little bit longer just because of COVID-related reasons. But what that means is that we only have a short period of time where everything needs to be addressed, bills need to be introduced, run through the whole song of how a bill becomes a law. It has to go through the House, through the Senate, and then be signed into law by the governor. So it's quite a process, and it's quite a short period of time in which that process needs to occur. The other thing is that I know that at one point, a couple of years back, one of our representatives did have an HR background, but most of our legislators do not. And so they do get advised by attorneys and other people who will share with them and help write the bills. But if you don't have an HR person kind of involved in that process, then sometimes the administrative piece of it can become a little bit convoluted, or we're not quite sure how to do different things. So we're finding some of that as we're trying to navigate this process and make best practices. The other thing to say is that this is not the first time that we've talked about equal pay. So there is a federal law that has existed for decades, and that is the Equal Pay Act. Now, the Equal Pay Act, prior to that, it was 100% legal and practiced that if you had two people in a position doing the same job, if that person happened to be a woman, that person could get paid 50% less. And so that was the practice. That was just the way that it was. And then the Equal Pay Act came in, EPA, and essentially said, nope, no longer, you can't do that anymore. However, the reason that we continue to see pay disparity is more of a systemic issue. So that means that if you have two people who are looking at a position that pays, let's say they're engineers, and it pays, between $55,000 and $60,000 a year. If you have someone, and let's say that person happens to be a man, who is currently making $50,000 a year, they may be asking for a $10,000 bump. And maybe they're saying, I want $60,000. And if you have a woman who's also a candidate and wants to apply for the position, and let's say she's at $45,000 and also asks for a $10,000 bump, she now gets $55,000 as her request for the position in consideration. If the company comes back and says, well, $60,000 is our top, so we're going to go ahead and give the man who asked for $60,000, we're going to give him $59,000 because we don't want to give him the top. But the woman who's asked for, $45,000 to $55,000, we'll go ahead and give her $55,000 because that's exactly what she asked for, and it's a $10,000 increase to her. The man still happens to be earning more, even if he didn't get what he asked for. And so over time, we have seen that compression change, and so women are now making on average 86 cents to the dollar, I think it is. And for being a woman and then another class as well, then that does decrease. So the interesting piece about that is that it's hard for anyone to go in and say, if I'm asking for a $10,000 bump, I should know inherently that I should actually be asking for $15,000 because that's what my counterpart might be asking for. And that's just challenging. That's hard. That's hard to assume people know to do that. That's hard to assume that it can be done. And so in the state of Colorado, they've said, no, no more. That's it. We're going to legislate it at a state level. We're going to say no longer can you pay people differently for doing substantially similar work unless there are certain requirements that that person meets in order to make more money. And they've given us what we call the yardstick of qualifications. And so we'll talk about that as well. Now, when the compliance piece comes in, what also happened with this new particular piece of legislation is that it's gone to what we call the division. I like to say it very officially, the division, which is with the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. And so the division is going to be the agency who is responsible for taking the law as it was written, interpreting what it meant, establishing rules and guidelines for how they're going to administer that and keep in compliance. And then we'll still see kind of in the runoff, what we call proof is in the pudding. And so most often what happens when we do have legislation that has some pieces that aren't as clear, is we do see that that kind of runs off when it's litigated. And so as HR people, we know we look at case law to kind of see, hey, we're not sure exactly how this works. And then we can look at case law and say, there's enough case law out there that it shows us this is the direction we should take. So we look at things that have been litigated in order to decide what direction to move forward. Because this is brand new, we just don't have that information. So that's just something to kind of understand, and an interesting situation that we certainly find ourselves in. Okay, enough history. One of the things that I am excited to report is the news flash, adopted rules. So I think it was November 2nd, the CDLE had a proposed hearing where they listened to people's feedback. I think that hearing was supposed to last about 2 hours or so. I know Jeannie, my business partner, ended up dropping off at almost 4. So there was a lot of questions and a lot of guidance, and the CDLE was taking that information in order to help make some more of these kind of vague areas more clear without changing the law itself. Again, they aren't the ones writing the law, that's the legislators. So they want to be really careful to not misinterpret what is being shared. So we had both proponents and opponents and a lot of different people on this call giving their thoughts. And so some very cool things came from that. We have our Colorado warning rules, and that stands for Colorado Whistleblower, Anti-Retaliation, Non-Interference, and Notice-Giving Rules. Essentially gave us some information from the division about how they're going to interpret some of the laws that have happened in the last year or so, including few, which I think is just fun to say, the Public Health Emergency Whistleblower Act, Healthy Families and Workplaces Act, which certainly has been significant with COVID, Equal Pay for Equal Work Act, which is what we're going to discuss mainly today, the Change to Compete Act, which is ban the box, and then also the Colorado Wage Act and Comps Order number 37. So there is a new comps order, very similar to the 36 that we've been operating under this year, but a little more clarity in some of those areas. So again, a lot to unpack. So we're going to really talk about Equal Pay for Equal Work Act. But if you do follow our blog, we are going to be sending out some marketing information about the hearing and those adopted rules that came out on the 11th. So let's talk about equal pay. So really we look at it and we kind of see there are two really different dynamics. We've got the money requirements, and then we've got kind of the position requirements. And so the Equal Pay, Equal Work Act requirements that they're substantiating at this point is, when we're looking at the money piece, is a few key areas. First, you're not allowed to seek wage history anymore. So if you have employment applications, or if it's a part of your job interview process in order to look at candidates to find out what they've made in the past, that will no longer be an allowed activity. And so you want to make sure that if you have online applications, you've got a paper application, we know this happens, you got a big organization, your managers are doing some of their own hiring, and they go to the reception desk, and that's where they find the old paper application that they've always used from 5 years ago. We want to make sure that if they are using that, that it doesn't ask for previous wage history, because that is no longer an allowable activity under the new law. Secondly, is to not prohibit wage discussion. Now, I'm going to say that with the NLRB from years and years ago, that there was a lot of protection around this already, but we have seen that in handbooks and different areas, people have used that tool to say things like, if you do discuss your pay or your wages with other employees, that could be a terminable offense. And just to be super clear, going forward, the Equal Pay, Equal Work Act, it really protects that activity. So once again, it is going to be not only allowed, but in some circumstances, people will probably be encouraged to discuss what they're making with their coworkers. So transparency is going to be important as you're looking at your compensation strategy moving forward. We want to ensure pay equity. One of the things that we've heard from the proponents of this particular piece of legislation is that you need to do a pay analysis. So you need to look at a pay analysis within 2 years to kind of look like not to look like, but to demonstrate that you are working toward pay equity in your organization. Now, interesting, sat on a webinar last week, and Mike and I were just chatting about this a little bit, where I had actually somebody say that it was an attorney and saying that I don't know if a pay analysis is the right thing to do. And I would say, oh, okay, I'm not sure how you could certainly establish pay equity. And we're really excited to speak back with that attorney, because I'll be honest, I don't know how you can ensure pay equity if you're not looking at your analysis. And so the argument from his perspective was it does take a lot of time and a lot of work to really work through a pay analysis, and I will attest to that. That is true. So I'm super curious what he says. I know somebody was asking, is the analysis required? According to what we understand from the proponents of this bill, of this legislation, is that this is the way you kind of protect yourself. So that if you were to have somebody make a claim, as long as you're showing that you are trying to be in compliance and doing that pay analysis, that you have some room for, I don't know, I don't want to call it good faith, because it's not really that. That's not what they're calling it. But if you can demonstrate that you've done a pay analysis on your compensation plan, that gives you a little bit more protection from litigation. Now, the one thing that we have heard as well, and this is why it says analysis within 2 years and 2 years and 2 years, is that would need to be an ongoing activity. So for 2 years, you would do it, and then another 2 years, you would need to do it, and so on and so forth. So again, those are just the things that we've heard from some of the attorneys that we've been connecting with. So just something to kind of hold a feather in your hat, understand, keep in your mind as far as you're walking through it. I will tell you that we certainly are doing it. In fact, the attorney polled the attendees on the webinar, and 75% of the people were doing one. So certainly something that a lot of people are doing. But if you have questions on that, I would certainly encourage you to speak with your counsel about your own particular situation. There is also some argument about having that done if you are going to do it with an attorney. I can see that being incredibly expensive, but there is the argument to be made that if you have an attorney do that, that information is protected now. You have attorney-client privilege, whereas if somebody else like HRX were helping you do that, that's not necessarily protected information if for some reason you were to find something that would be bad. I'll be honest, most of the time when we found that with our clients, they have been surprised. I haven't seen anybody say, I want to pay women less. That is my goal for our organization. That is our strategy. I don't have anyone say that, but when it does happen, people are honestly surprised. They didn't realize that it was happening in the areas that they didn't know. And one thing to note is that we actually know, not ourselves or a client of ours, but a colleague we know, we actually have heard of a situation where a man was given a 52% increase in their salary. And this is an organization that had 20,000 people in it. So they had a pretty substantial HR team, but because of equal pay, equal work, they did this, and he was not being paid to the level of where his colleagues were being paid for doing substantially similar work. So again, this isn't about women getting paid more than men, it's about pay equity across the board. So just something to kind of understand as you're working through it. And then the other piece of that money requirement is that you track your wage history for every employee. I put that in here just because I think that it's material for the actual legislation and the law itself. However, I think a lot of people have that ability to do that in their payroll systems. So if you don't, for some reason, certainly take a look at that, because that's going to be important, but something to kind of keep in mind as you're working through your strategies. Now let's talk about the position requirements. So position requirements, these are the big ones, and actually what a lot of the adopted rules addressed, in my opinion. So I think that's good news. Position requirements communicate positions with pay, with some exceptions you're going to see in italics there. And so one of the things, and just forgive me as I'm looking at my notes, but one of the things that they have stated in the adopted rules from the division is that exceptions to this rule, when that could qualify, where you wouldn't necessarily need to communicate all of your pay promotions or position information out to your workforce, is if, for example, you had someone in the position currently and they weren't aware that you were going to be looking for someone else. However, they're pretty clear that once other people start to know, then your requirement is to share that out with the workforce. The other one is that if you know, and this has more to do with the posting promotions, so communicating positions with pay, some exceptions on this would be like the general description. So it is going to be a requirement that when you're out posting on Indeed or LinkedIn or ZipRecruiter, any of those job boards, that as you are posting on those job boards, part of the requirement is you are now posting at least with a pay range. Now they had said pay range and benefits. So again, the exceptions here, they're talking that you need to now have like a general description. So if you have a pay rate, like an hourly rate, plus a potential commission, you need to share what that generally could be, as well as benefits that would be material would be things like health insurance, health and welfare, 401k, any kind of profit sharing, but things like a gym membership would not need to be shared out as far as that job posting is concerned. Why this is important, I'm going to get to when we talk about low-hanging fruit in a moment. The other thing is posting your promotions then internally. So again, this is going to have some of those exceptions. If you have somebody in the position, then you want to make sure that they're not aware that you're looking for that, especially some of your higher level roles. That could be a reason why you might be starting to look at that and posting out to the marketplace and not sharing out. Also, automatic promotions. So sometimes I've had in one of the groups that we've shared this information, I had somebody who said, I have a VP of technology that we want to make an RVP of technology. And we've been talking to this person and that was the goal and we were developing them into that role. So now do I need to post that promotion opportunity company-wide, or at least in the state of Colorado? And the answer was yes, until we got these adopted rules where it says you can have kind of that automatic promotion opportunity for those positions. However, the goal and intention needs to be that there's some documentation around it, like in an offer letter or intention letter, something like that. And it needs to be done within 1 year of hiring. If that is not the case, then having to post the promotion opportunity to all people is kind of the lay of the land. And then the other thing is temporary positions. So if you have no intention, you've got some people working for you for a temporary position, and there's not really any intention to bring them on, that would also not need to be a position that you would need to share out. However, if you were going to promote one of those temporary employees into a position because they're a rock star and doing an amazing job, then posting internally to your workforce and announcing that you're going to have an opportunity is going to be a requirement. The other piece is keeping job descriptions. So we've had to do a lot of record retention in HR, documentation. But your job descriptions, that's kind of new. We've never really had to have job descriptions with our employee files before, but this is certainly something that they are saying is going to need to be tracked. So your wage history and your job descriptions are going to need to kind of relay with each other, especially if people have moved into different positions. You want to keep a record of those things. Okay, so let's talk about it with my risk business folks out there. Always what I get is, okay, well, what happens? What happens if we don't do these things? So the employer liability, one of the other pieces that we learned part of this adopted rules is that they are not going to look at anything prior to January 1st of 2021. That was a little gray. We weren't sure what the timeline would look like, but it looks like they aren't going to look at any claims that would go before January 1st. So we've got some grace there. Now, if we have any violations of those money requirements, right? So not seeking pay history, prohibiting wage discussion, ensuring pay equity, like some of those things that we're talking about, then what we have heard or what we've kind of relayed is that it could result in the economic damages. And from what we know is that they could have looked back up to 3 years. There are some qualifications for that, but let's say 3 years. So they could go back and say, oh yes, we do see that there's a pay equity issue here. So you are owed, back wages for up to 3 years. Liquidated damages, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. Legal and equitable relief, I'm assuming that means things like probably attorney's fees, things in that nature, and then reasonable costs. So I'm not sure, question, is that benefits as well? Like, should they have made a certain profit margin? I'm not sure. So just things to kind of understand that we'll understand this more and more as we move through this next year and the next few years. So coming back to liquidated damages in employment law, that is equal to economic damages. So let's just talk about that for a minute. If we have a position that we know should have been paid, let's say, I'll just make math easy, $5 more an hour, right? And we're looking back at 3 years. We're roughly around 10 grand. So now we're at like $30,000. If we didn't do some of those pay equity things like the audit or trying to look to make sure that we're equitable or working toward this, could that be a reason that you would be assessed liquidated damages as well as economic damages? So now not only are we at that $30,000 in pay equity issue, but now we're at 60, including liquidated damages. So it can be pretty hefty. Again, if you have questions about that and concerns about your own potential strategy, I'm always happy to answer questions, but normally at some point we usually do engage legal counsel for your own specific situations. Now let's talk about the violations of the position requirements. So communicate all jobs internally with some exceptions, as we've talked about, post jobs with pay rates and a description of benefits. So once again, we don't have to have everything in there, kind of soup to nuts, but we do need to have a general description. And then keeping job descriptions for every employee, very, very important. So just something to understand. What this means is it could result in between a $500 to $10,000 per situation violation. It's a big range. What's the difference between $500 and $10,000? Honestly, I couldn't tell you. It could be, again, whether or not you made an effort to try to do this. It could be the judge you get that day. We're going to learn a lot through litigation and case law as we start to walk through this. What we do know is that it's one promotional opportunity. So if you post 3 jobs tomorrow, those are 3 opportunities for potential non-compliance. So just something to kind of keep in mind. This is that low-hanging fruit. Normally, we know that it takes some time for laws to kind of catch up into the workplace. We're small employers, especially here in Northern Colorado. We got a lot going on. I'm not following every single piece of legislation that comes out of the legislature. I happen to be following a lot about employment law, but I couldn't tell you anything about ag law or infrastructure and roads. That's not my area. So normally it does take some time for people to kind of catch up. The issue with this is that if you do post a position without your pay ranges on January 2nd, because let's hope you're not working on New Year's, but on January 2nd, you're going to be really obvious to anybody that's looking for that. And they're going to start to look and say, okay, who's on a compliance? We've heard that there are going to be plaintiff attorneys who are going to be looking at those job feeds. So all the more reason to really just try to make sure that that low-hanging fruit is something you're really addressing right away, especially like the jobs that you might have a lot of turnover in. Things like that are going to be important because these can be pretty steep pretty quick. So we want to, what does this mean to me? We don't want you to be the one litigated, right? We don't want you to be the one we all learn from. That's the goal, is that you're going to be walking through this and it's a long process. So we understand that. We want to try to avoid that. So if you were to ask Amanda of HRX, what is it that she feels is really important? These are the areas I'd be looking at. I'd be looking at your hiring processes, making sure that everything is really in alignment there. And we're going to touch base on that a little bit here. I'd be looking at your promotions. Typically, I think people have kind of said, hey, we have this high performing person in our organization. We want to move them up. We want to give them more responsibility. We want to reward them for their success. And we're going to go ahead and do that, have that conversation with them, and then we'll announce to the company. If we do that going forward, that is no longer going to be allowed. It now requires that when you are going to look at a promotion opportunity, it's not so much now about the person, it's more about the position, and that we're going to have a position that then we need to share with the entire organization, because we don't know who has knowledge, skills, and abilities for this particular job. It doesn't mean that you have to interview people who are not qualified for the position. That has been clarified for sure. However, it is saying that you do need to post it out and give people an opportunity. At the same time, notify everyone that this opportunity exists so that anyone could put their ring in the hat, or their hat in the ring, so to speak. So that's going to be a big change, I think. Compensation strategy, this is complicated. It depends on how big your organization is, how many positions you have. Oftentimes I'll talk with employers and they'll say, well, can you help us with this, Amanda, because we only have 60 people, right? And it's not so much about that. If you have 60 people in 5 positions, you know, that's a lot easier. But if you got 60 people in 40 positions, it becomes complicated. So you've really got to kind of look and understand, what is your comp strategy and what are you trying to do generally and holistically as an organization in order to tie it to this particular piece of legislation. And then record keeping requirements, which it's important 100%, but I don't feel like the record keeping requirements, aside from the fact that you need good job descriptions, are really much heavier than what we already know as HR. So this is just a screen to kind of share, this is our process for walking through it, just to give you kind of a snapshot, an idea of what we typically do. It's involved, I'm not gonna lie. So we review our comp strategy, kind of determine our direction. We go through a job analysis. We then group our job descriptions based on that analysis. And some data points that we need to know from our leadership in our organizations. What is your goal? What are you trying to do so that we can use the right method to rank our positions? And then benchmarking, we look at that external data so that we can pull in that midpoint and understand, does this align with what our compensation strategy looks like? And then salary grade, so we determine that. Are you going to do broad banding, or are you going to have job specific kind of salary grades? What does that look like? Because it can be more complex. It also depends on the size of your organization. You know, if you've got a lot of people in your organization, broadbanding may not make sense. It just totally depends a lot on your own circumstances. And then a compliance evaluation. So standard deviations, kind of what we've heard. It's what we know is from the OFCCP, or if you have to have an affirmative action plan, we know they've kind of said that standard deviation requirement is ±2. We also heard from another attorney doing a regression analysis could also be really helpful. So when you're talking about what does that analysis look like, these are some of the things that we have been told, because the law itself doesn't say you must use the standard deviation method or you must use this. They're saying that it needs to be done, it needs to be equitable, your pay ranges. So we're looking at case law from Equal Pay Act federally, from the affirmative action plans from the Supreme Court, to try to build what is held up before when it comes to pay equity. So some of the things that I usually try to share with people is a couple areas. One, when you're talking about your strategic direction, first, it's really important to understand, how are we doing it now? Like, what is our method? Is it kind of all over the place? Are we in silos? Do our managers kind of make their own decisions and then they let HR know? One of the things, and I love HR, so I'm going to speak from that standpoint, is it is now important to make sure that your HR is involved in that process and really understands what you're trying to do rather than an afterthought. That's just going to be really important in order for us to do our jobs, which is mitigate that risk and establish culture. So it's really important for us to be a part of that. So you really need to take a look at it and say, how are we doing this today? Then you need to understand, if you haven't already, what is your compensation strategy? Who are you in the marketplace? How big is your marketplace? Are you just Northern Colorado? Are you all of Colorado? Are you the nation? Are you an international organization? And then you have to start to look at it and say, okay, but still, who are we pulling in? Do we have remote workers from across the planet? Or is it just really, Fort Collins, Greeley? So you start to kind of understand what that picture looks like. And then you further understand, what is our strategy? Is our design, are we a startup and we're going to be lagging the market? Most of our stuff is going to be in profit sharing or stock options, or maybe even like just flexible benefits, and that's what people are looking for. And so we don't pay market rate because we offer different types of benefits. The other thing that I would say is the match strategy would be more like, we are now looking at the market and we want to be as close to that midpoint of the external market as we can. But without understanding what that midpoint is, it's hard to move forward. And then the last one is lead. Are we trying to pay above market? Like, that is our strategy. And so all of these really have different kinds of consequences and benefits. So you need to really understand that. And as your HR person, you have to have that conversation with your leadership so that you all are toeing the line and moving the same direction. And then what I always like to think about, there's rank factor, there is ranking, there's point factor, there's several million, thousand different ways to decide how you want to rank your positions. I like to look at it as say, what buckets do you need and what's important? So, we are a consulting company. So for us, yes, HR is incredibly important, but it's equally important that someone can be in a client-facing, changing role because we're moving from this client to that client. That's a big bucket for us. So we need to be looking at the people we have who can do those types of tasks for certain positions. So the same thing, you need to decide, what buckets do you need and which ones are bigger? Which one needs to be filled the most? Because that's going to be really important as you're trying to develop your own strategies. So let's talk about the yardstick of qualifications. When you're looking at your strategy, again, the things that we've learned is that you cannot ask for previous wage history. That cannot be a qualification. Market and what the market is doing is not a qualification for paying someone differently. And I would say that in the past, discretion has been a huge piece of how we've paid people, whether it's market discretion because of what the external market was doing at the time. So we paid this person a lot lower than this person. We were in a recession. And so that's where that disparity happened. Or negotiation skills. Some people are better negotiators than others in their salary. And then managers. Managers are different, have different philosophies. And so sometimes it's based on manager discretion, or when we give pay raises to people, things like that. So the compensation system differential is based on these things. So unlike Equal Pay Act, the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act in Colorado has given us the areas that we can use. And those are seniority system. So, people have been here a while, they have a more seniority over others. A merit system. I like the merit system, and I think a lot of people kind of start to gravitate toward that. But I would say there are some things you really need to think about, like your performance management systems. When I talk with people who do annual performance reviews, first, doing it annually can lead to very subjective results. You can do things like recency factor. If somebody was recently doing really well, but kind of was tanking at the beginning of the year, we forget that. If they're doing maybe really poorly right now because something significant happened to someone that's really important to them, that's going to affect them, maybe we're not remembering all the good things they did at the beginning of the year. So if you're doing annual performance reviews and you're not kind of keeping track of the whole year, it can be a little bit misleading. As well as, and I'm just going to say, I don't understand the 5-point system, like 1 through 5. I personally don't. I think a lot of times people look at it because they're like, it's like the grading system, right? From our secondary education, it's like A, B, C, D, F. And A, if they get a 5, they're doing an A job. But when I really ask managers to describe to me what the difference between a 3 and a 4 is, it's challenging. And so I think when you're using a merit system, you really need to have some good metrics to help you substantiate why somebody would get a 4 and others wouldn't. And I think that's important. We've seen managers, I'm sure you've heard it, where they'll say things like, I'll never give a 5. I just won't. That's perfect. No one is perfect. That's hard, but maybe they won't give 5s all around, but you need metrics to say, oh, in this area, they definitely were exceeding expectations and outstanding, or whatever you qualify a 5 as. But I definitely think that there is room for growth there. Quality or quantity, we see this oftentimes. We have some trucking clients that, this is something we're kind of exploring, and I've seen it a lot in like food production, piecemeal, right? Or piecework. So you get paid by the product or how much you actually deliver or pull. So that would be probably an easier metric to work through. Geographic area, depending on who you talk to, we've had some people say, we don't think that Greeley and Fort Collins is geographically different enough to have big paid differences. But maybe Greeley to Denver does. I've heard other people say that is totally a geographic qualification. It just really depends. So something to kind of look at as you're pulling your market data. And then education, experience, or training, certainly other certifications, higher level of education, a little bit more easy to kind of get behind, and whether or not that position has to travel. So if you've got 2 people doing the same job, but one is like outside and traveling and road warrior and one is not, you could have a difference in pay for that reason. So when we're walking through it, creating that comp model for us, you want to group into the right job categories for you and the families you're looking for. You want to create that job grade. So you can use like a broad banding method, which is a really big range, but usually used for mainly smaller organizations. Or you want to determine like different salary ranges and what that looks like for your particular positions and why it is. Maybe one position, if you're using ranking method, is because this is very important to your organization. If you lost that person, or I also just did it myself, if you lost that position, it would be significant to you. So again, you're trying to look at it based on position, not person. These are some of the things that we're covering in our workshops, what they mean more. This again is just that overview. And then benchmarking. So the only thing I'm going to really say about benchmarking is that I probably met with about 12 vendors to ask them about benchmarking, and I learned a lot. Benchmarking is important, especially if you're trying to find that midpoint to do, your comp ratio and see where people align to that midpoint and whether they're way higher or way lower and why that might be the case. But you need the midpoint to do that. Oftentimes you use that with external, and that's why you need to know what your strategy is, lead, lag, match, whatever, in order to kind of pull that data and start there. You could use internal as well, but if you have pay equity issues, then you might already be starting off in the wrong foot. So just something to kind of keep in mind. If you're looking at a tool yourself, some of the things that I really encourage, be careful of the tool, because there's a lot of tools out there like Glassdoor, salary.com, where you can go get free information, or even the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The issue with those is that sometimes they have crowdsourced data, which means that I could go in and say, I'm a controller and I make this much money, and I have no business being a controller. So we want to get data that is really good. Sometimes you need industry data. If you're a particular niche industry, you're going to need to look at what kind of data you can pull in for that. But even then, pulling more of a general compensation data point might be helpful, because even if you're niche, you have to think about who are you hiring though into your organization, and kind of trying to establish what that metric looks like. So there's a lot to that, and it's important to understand. And using the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I think, is great. However, for HR people, for example, they have 3 positions, just 3. They've got the HR coordinator and assistant. They've got HR specialists, which I'm assuming includes generalists, business partners, all of those people as well. And then they have HR manager, which is going to be your managers, your directors, your CHROs, your VPs, and your spread is going to be massive. So for broadbanding purposes, that's amazing. But if you're really trying to dig in and see what a CHRO is making for your organization, you need something that has a little more meat to it than the BLS can provide. Not to mention that you have to look at data, and even if you're doing it every 2 years and reusing your comp data from 2 years before, it's important to know how to age that data so that you're pulling relevant to where you are today. So what tool you use, your vendors, that's going to be important as you're walking through your process. And then the evaluation. So again, we talked about the standard deviation, regression analysis, where you can look at a lot of different data points. It's a lot of math, it's a lot of work, or a really, really savvy person in Excel. But you really have to kind of understand how to do those things in order to be able to come back then and see, do you have anything that is flagged as a potential concern? And the concept that all ships rise with the tide is pretty important in this, because the one thing we have heard over and over is that according to this law, it's not like you can see someone who's above everyone, let's say up above that 2-point standard deviation, and then lower them down. The concept is that they're above that 2-point standard deviation and everyone else needs to be raised up. So that could be really expensive. But sometimes when we're looking at that, all of a sudden we realize, well, this person is a lead person, they're a supervisor, they've been here for 15 years, those types of things. And that helps us to be able to see, well, this person in this position is making this level because they have all these qualifications, all these yardstick metrics that help us to understand that. And now we can help build more around our compensation strategy so that we're in compliance as an organization. And it has to be the intention then that you're also going to look at anybody who falls into those categories and move them up as well. So as we're rolling through the end here, some of the things we've talked about, kind of the requirements, how we work through it, grouping our positions, the testing, and then our changes. So now we roll through and we start to make those changes. And in some of these sessions that I've done for other entities, I've had great questions. Well, what happens when my people start talking with each other about their pay? Our encouragement is that the most transparent that you are comfortable being will be easier for you in the long run. It's not up to us to tell you exactly how transparent you should be, but the most that you can be will be helpful, because then if you know, Bill and Sue are making different money but working in the same job, but Sue's making less money than Bill, but she also sees that he is producing 50% more than she is. This is going to be less of an issue, because the most you can communicate with your employees how they earn money will make them more productive, happier, and less likely to be concerned. And the biggest reason for this is that one of the pieces of this piece of legislation is that there isn't an administrative process. There are options. You can go to the division. So if you're a claimant or you're a person who feels like you're not being paid equitably to your counterpart, the suggested way of addressing that is to go to your manager and say that. I feel like there's a pay issue here. If nothing happens, then you can make a claim to the division, and the division can come in and research it and investigate. And part of the rules that they shared with us last week includes what that process looks like. Or you can go straight to an attorney and they can help you sue the employer. And the thing is that from how we understand it, is that there's no administrative reason. Like, you don't have to go step 1, step 2, step 3. You could go straight to attorney and make a claim. And so that's why the most transparent that we can be will be healthier for you in the long run. And then training. So I know that we all have organizations where we have been a part of, where we have managers who are doing their own hiring, where we have different hiring practices happening. We're in silos, not everything is as streamlined as we'd like it to be sometimes. So this is important. It's important then to get in with your team. With our clients, we've gone in and done this training and shared with them this exact same information so that they are aware. And at the end of the day, as long as your managers and people who are responsible for promoting people, hiring people, managing people in any way, shape, or form, if all they remember is, I need to go talk to my HR person, winning, right? Because that's what we want. We want them to come to us to be able to help walk them through really good best practices when it comes to being in compliance with this law, but generally being in alignment with the organization as a whole. And you will be the best resource for them to be able to do that. So we talked about it, processes and procedures. Those are the next steps, the things that you want to look at. How are we posting our jobs right now? What is our internal posting? Is it a bulletin board? Is it the fridge in the break room because we've got 6 people in our office? Is it on intranet and we need to make sure that people are aware of it? Or is it on Slack or some kind of channel that we can use through kind of social collaboration tools? Whatever that looks like, it's going to be really important. And then, like I said, keeping those job descriptions with wage history needs to be done for every employee after termination up to 2 years. And then we're encouraging people to keep interview notes, really important. If your candidate tells you what they made in the past, don't write that down. Like, that's not material. And based on what we've heard from the legislature is that generally they would say you might even need to start the process over because now you know that information. So for us, we're just saying really keep the best practice of not asking that information when I'm interviewing people and they start to tell me, well, in the past, I'm like, it doesn't matter. I'm not worried about what you made in the past. I would like to know what you would like to make for this position here. And you can totally ask that all day long. You just can't ask them what they've made before. So that takes us to the end. I know we're right at time. I do want to encourage you, the workshops that we are putting together, really focusing on what qualifies as a good job description. I know that seems simple, but I am telling you, HRX has been working on this for well over a year. We have really fine-tuned a lot of our processes that we thought we had kind of pat down. So we wanted to share that information with you, as well as really establishing what pay equity looks like. What does that even mean? How do I do it? How do I run some of those analysis? And what does that look like for my own organization? So we do want to encourage you to take a look at those other workshops. I wanted to say thank you to Mike and Elevate. We really enjoy being able to participate with them. Our biggest goal for this is just to get information out there. That being said, I think, just thank you. So for everyone, I'll go ahead and put into the chat just my email. If you have any questions, again, I know we're right at time, and I'm not seeing any in here that I don't think we got to. So if you do have any questions, you're welcome to reach out. Otherwise, I want to say thank you. I wish you all the very best the rest of this week, and we'll be in touch again here soon. Thank you for your time. Have a great rest of your day.